Hello and welcome to this session today in partnership with Marcia McCarroll and Carol Cooper of Discover Your Best Limited Consulting. I'm just very honored really and glad to be involved and just providing this session for free really to everybody involved as a way of really just sort of giving back at this difficult time and getting folks a chance to learn some useful things for their workplace and their work in general. So we've called this subject today traumatic. And I've put for the subtitle here, why trauma awareness is needed and helpful in today's working world. Elsewhere, I've done sessions on this sort of subject, and I've talked about experiencing safe professional relationships. You're going to see, I think, in this session how profoundly deep and true those statements are. It's helpful to understand this subject. It's not a subject many of us bump into, but it may be relevant not just to us as individuals, but in our work and the types of work sometimes that we're dealing with. And even just as an awareness piece for us creating, healthy, happy, safe working environments where people can, flourish and do their best. So we're going to dive straight in. Why trauma is an increasingly important theme. So we're going to illustrate this in a moment, but a little quote for you here, to one who lives in fear, everything rustles. Now, what does this quote mean? It means there are people around us, you may not be aware of this, who live their lives fundamentally in fear. Okay, now that may seem a bit strange to you or I, but they do. And to those kinds of people, little things can cause a sort of startle reaction and a not very centered, grounded, confident, or resourceful response. And this is a thing we're going to come back to again and again and again. If I live my life fundamentally on edge, then I'm going to probably have some difficulties that I barely understand, much less that I can do much about. Now, as you'll see, this subject matters because, as it says here, these are some sort of notes to sort of read through if we come back to this later on. But basically, who and how we are predicts our life and our work outcomes. Okay, so let's say I'm a fundamentally organized person, okay? I could probably be quite a good manager, probably be relied upon to get things done. If for whatever reasons, which can be, by the way, trauma related, I'm a not very organized person, okay, it's fine, it is as it is, we love and accept people as they are, okay, but I'm not really going to become a manager, am I? Because I'm not going to succeed, even on a simple sort of aspect like that. Now, what happens is with trauma people who've been affected by trauma in childhood or in adulthood, there's a little phrase there, it says, never again. Never again will this terrible thing happen to me again. Okay, and they're not walking around thinking, Marcia, I've had bad experiences, I'm not letting them such things ever happen to me again, so I'm going to be on my guard against you at all times. They're not consciously thinking this, but it may show up in their working relationships with you, or if you're in a class, say, and Marcia, you've told me about some of the classes you run, some folks may be sitting there kind of on a subconscious level thinking, oh, bad things have happened, no one will ever, cause anything bad to happen to me again. So that's just part of building this picture that we're going to build here. Now, we've all got baggage, as it says here. Okay, I've got some. Marcia, even you've got some. And Carol, well, maybe you've got some too. But, okay, for plenty of us, thankfully, it's not too difficult in life for some of us to have baggage, but still, get on pretty okay. Yeah, in life and work and what have you. But some people, as it's here, have not only baggage that they may or may not be vaguely aware of, they have baggage that is mysteriously hard to pin down, and they may have literally no real clue where their difficulties are coming from. And sometimes the difficulties are coming from themselves. They are their own worst enemy, but almost cruelly, they don't have a clue what really is going on, because it's deep and it's significant, as we're going to see. Now, some baggage is vast, affecting us and how we go about our life and work, and some baggage, as it says here, can be severely limiting, especially if its existence and the form it takes is very painfully unclear to us. And that's really why this subject is important, because we can have baggage that we're not aware of. So it's helpful, I want to suggest in our session today, to understand, first of all, what is this trauma thing and what impact can it have on me and other people around me? How can we be more aware of its presence and its power, and what can we possibly do about it? Because let me tell you, I've mentioned to you guys before, this is a beast of a big subject, yeah. Okay? And we want to just focus here, not on, getting depressed by these types of subjects, but on what can we actually be more aware of and mindful of, and what can we frankly do about it individually and within our organizations and the people that we work with. The goal being, obviously, by the time we leave this session, that we've got some practical steps we can take to continue on the journey. So let's begin. You notice I've got a bright yellow sort of, alert as opposed to red flags. Or, red alerts, because, what tends to happen is we need to be aware of the need for some caution when we're getting around folks who may have suffered what we're going to call trauma. Now, sometimes, as it says, it's partly my commentary as opposed to yours. Sometimes we work with others, be they clients, groups, staff members, etc., and they show what I would call unusually difficult reactions or responses. Or sometimes they show a lack of them. You know, they just seem to be sort of numb to everything, for example. Now, their lives may be fraught with troubles, sometimes of a serious nature, but don't forget, we can't usually talk about this, can we? You know, if you know somebody, you can't usually say to them, you know, I have noticed your life seems very fraught with lots of serious troubles. It's a conversation, especially at work, we're not about to have, okay? But when we notice people having these sorts of difficulties, what sorts of difficulties may they be? Okay, now this is all on a continuum, okay? We're all a little bit on the continuum, but some people are much further along the continuum than others of us. So, for example, people that always seem to feel unsafe, they're constantly trying to defend themselves, protect themselves. They seem to get into lots of scrappy fights and things of an emotionally charged nature. That's not typical, thankfully, but there are people that seem to do this, and they may not even know why, much less us understand what's going on. People with an inability to sort of manage emotions, yeah? You know, oh, they might be letting some people go at work. Oh my goodness. And so there's a phrase here, you know, the alarm is worse than the fire. You know, their reaction is so intense or so all over the place, they actually almost make it happen because they have such a strong and relatively, you know, we could say immature, or we could say, you know, intense reactions to things that just are dysfunctional, paralyzing, etc. And people who are overwhelmed if they're facing some kind of loss of any kind, you know, maybe they do lose their job. Okay, that will destroy some people for quite some time. They may never fully get over it. Okay, whereas your more sort of healthier, well-adjusted person might, you know, deal with it in a reasonable manner. But sometimes, of course, folks act in ways that actually help to make those things happen. You know, they treat their boss terribly. They end up losing their job because of their inability to sort of behave in a manner that's relatively, you know, acceptable or understandable. Some of those folks lose opportunities because they're unable to understand or process or act in ways that help them advance their lives or their careers. And other people, there's a fourth one here that basically suggests, you know, some people live in what we call the eternal present. They just live in the present moment. They don't particularly think about the future, face the future, then they wonder why their career doesn't go anywhere, or they wonder why they can't seem to sort of get on and earn a little bit more money and enjoy one or two more good things. They seem a bit stuck, lacking the ability to plan for, and sometimes even the imagination to consider how to create a healthier future. You've heard of that term, probably, learned helplessness. That is a term that's become more future. So today we simply want to ask, you know, what's going on when we encounter these kinds of things, and how best can we be able to respond to things. In terms of trauma research, again, it's a bit like that one we did the other week, isn't it, on you know, relationship research. You know, how on earth can trauma research help me as a person in the modern workplace or working with different sort of groups and things? I want to suggest that our goal here is that when we're facing any types of what I've described as somewhat extreme behaviours, you know, intense fear, anger, emotions, poor coping skills, maybe even substance abuse to relatively dysfunctional degrees, or if we're dealing with the lack of some to us basic adult behaviours, emotions or skills, that we need to be making progress in how we respond to these people. Because just imagine it, you know, people with very intense or difficult sort of reactions and behavior and stuff, we might feel concerned for them and want to sort of support them because their reaction is bigger than your average reaction. But sometimes what we do is this. We tend to, in our heads, if not to the person themselves, say, you know, what's the matter with you? You know, calm down. Hold it together, come on, you know, be a grown-up, put on your big girl pants, or whatever we want to say to people. If not directly, then, you know, in the background. So in other words, we can experience what you might call bafflement, frustration, and just sheer disappointment. You know, I wish they'd get their act together. I wish they'd show up to class. I wish they'd do this. I wish they'd do that. For their good, not just for our benefit. So I'm suggesting we've got to go in this journey today, and in general, from what's the matter with you to a little bit of, you know, I wonder what happened to them, to make them quite like this, okay? In other words, what is it that they had to survive in life that has led them to be this way? Because I'm the last person who wants to say, oh, you know, this made me this kind of person, this made me that kind of person, because I believe in choice and I believe in all these other liberating things. But I have to say, this is one area where we have to concede that to some extent, this stuff can quite almost literally make people behave in these difficult ways, and they don't even barely know they're doing it. And that's tough stuff, because, you know, you and me, we believe in coaching and progress and learning. Okay, some people can't really learn, can't really see what's in front of them, and can't do much about it. And that is pretty darn serious stuff. The goal is, where possible, to sort of learn to do our part and to create some safe and supportive environments. So eventually we're going to talk about, you know, a trauma-informed workplace and trauma-informed, you know, care and support of our staff or those that we're working with. So let's crack on then and do some definitions here. What is the definition of trauma? Well, I think it's helpful to talk about wounding rather than trauma. Okay, so let's give you some examples. In childhood, we may have been a little bit wounded. You know, mum, dad, whoever brought us up, you know, they weren't perfect. They got it, you know, did it a little bit all over the place here and there. These are things that may have hurt us a little bit in childhood and maybe have affected us and maybe have affected us longer term. So, for example, a needy parent who's just, you know, very needy and very sort of, oh, my baby type thing, you know, but relies on them emotionally, this kind of stuff, that can do us a bit of harm, bit of damage. Some bullying, maybe, in school, you know, a rough incident or two in school, you know, failing some exams, losing some opportunities that would have been good opportunities. These can be what we call childhood wounds. And those come in many different forms. Now, you'll be aware that we can also suffer what you might call adulthood wounds, too. Absolutely. Doesn't necessarily stop in childhood. So, you know, if we had, you know, an unfortunately nasty boss, you know, it might not wipe us out, but it might, you know, hurt us a little bit. And that was a rough patch. That nasty cold workplace. I've heard horror stories, people working in the for-profit world who've just been treated like, you know, dispensable objects, and that's hurt them to some degree. A poor fit, if you do a job that's totally not your cup of tea, that could be, you know, kind of a rough, tough, you know, hurtful patch in terms of your coping skills and things. Now, these, I just want to be clear at sort of the lower end of the spectrum. In life and in work. You know, these are, you know, mildly scarring experiences maybe, versus the very important term we're going to obviously explore now, which is traumatic experiences. Okay, so a little bit of background here. I looked up the word trauma. It comes apparently from the Greek, and it really literally means wound. Okay, well, that would make sense. But also, just before we look at the definition, look how much the increased usage has been in recent decades. Okay, up and up and up and up and up. And that's one of the reasons that we're looking at it today, is to sort of work out, okay, what's going on with this word trauma? I would suggest since 2010, it's gone up and up even more, to the point where we're in danger of getting quite confused. So a sort of dictionary definition would be a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Okay, life tragedies, you know, significant losses, whatever that may be. It's a difficult, horrible experiences, or the emotional shock following a stressful event or a physical injury, which may be associated with physical shock and sometimes leads to long-term neurosis. And in medicine, obviously, it could be a physical injury. Okay, so let's go deeper. Let's define it properly as trauma is a psychologically distressing event outside of the range of usual human experience, often involving a sense of intense fear, terror, or helplessness. Important part of this definition is that it's something over which we had no control. Very important part of the definition, no control. I was subjected to this. Could be a car accident. You know, this truck came plowing into me, absolutely horrified, utterly traumatizing. Okay, you get the idea. But an important part of this is, it says here, trauma theory suggests that many of the behavioral symptoms that we see in individuals are a direct result of coping with adverse experiences. What we identify as maladaptive behaviors are really misapplied survival skills. So for example, let's take the car accident, okay? You may decide, oh my goodness, cars are dangerous, traveling's dangerous, I'm not gonna do that again probably, even though I kind of need to. Okay, now that is a survival skill, isn't it, that you're trying to apply because you got hurt or very, very severely traumatized, and you're trying to avoid it again. But of course, that's not necessarily maladaptive. You're trying to survive. Yeah. And you're going to have to obviously work through that and sort of heal from that. You get the idea. So this leads to, this is just my sort of commentary here really, this leads to what you might call overgeneralized reactions. You know, a woman once hurt me, therefore I will avoid all women, would be an overreaction, you know, to a traumatizing, you know, breakup or something. And that can just end up having a sort of what we call a default reaction to stuff in general. You know, if you've had an experience with a dangerous person, you could decide people are dangerous. Okay, but you can see that's too much. It's almost an overreaction to try to protect yourself against something that hurt really badly. So because shutting down or having a certain reaction once helped me survive, I'll tend to have that as a default setting. So, you know, some people believe that the workplace is dangerous. People are out to get you. Okay, it's not going to help you really, navigate in a sort of resourceful manner. And some people aren't aware of why this is the case, why they feel this is the case, and how that's maybe getting in their way is really the message. I think, want to be clear as well, there's a possibility of healing from trauma too. Okay, we're going to come back to that later on, but frankly, it's more complicated than we tend to think. We can't talk people out of this. These are deeply ingrained emotional reactions. Yes, so I mean, for example, I've heard stories over the years of people with parents that are petrified that the kids are going to abandon them and leave them and not care anymore. Okay, but what that leads to is a deep fear that comes up almost daily for them. And they literally become very, very needy of, lots of attention and reassurance because presumably somebody once left them, and that really hurt, and they're always petrified of other people leaving. You can see that this is understandable, but nonetheless potentially debilitating stuff. Somebody once said, all my life, my heart has yearned for a thing I cannot name. All right, one more little slide here, and then I'm going to pause for you guys. So what do we mean? Okay, I keep talking about things are on a spectrum of degree. Of course, that's life usually. Okay, I want to suggest really that we have a very careful use of this word trauma. Okay, some people have even said, this COVID period has been traumatic. Okay, well, that's fair enough in some senses. But again, we want to just be careful, I suggest, in our use of trauma, because we may have had what you could maybe describe as a slightly genuinely traumatic experience. Being ignored on a major issue at work could be, if it's serious enough, potentially somewhat slightly traumatic because, the serious long-term consequences of that decision. Then there are what I would just suggest are, semi-traumatic experiences. I wouldn't say it was traumatic, but I would say it was, was quite traumatic because I had no control and the consequences were serious and huge and what have you. And then there are what I would want to describe as full-on childhood or life trauma experiences. They're very serious stuff that we're going to come on to. There are different types of trauma too. You're getting that idea already. We could be attacked in some terrible way. A knife held to our throats or our bodies, all sorts of other kinds of attacks. It could be a terrible accident. Somebody else died even if you didn't. Even frankly, conversation with really, really horrid, terrible, traumatizing people could be a traumatic experience in some sense. Or semi-traumatic. And then there's other bits we're going to come on to here. You've heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. Again, we can't get into those subjects, but I want to just mention to you that because of the different types of trauma, there are other kinds of post-traumatic effect. One of those is called complex post-traumatic disorder. We'll clarify that a little bit more. But I mean, it's the difference between, a one-time incident and a complexity of things that have really taken their toll upon us. So, oh, I think I pushed the wrong button. Sorry, there we go. Oh my gosh. All right, sorry. We have now got subtitles appearing. Is that on your screen too?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so I'm sorry, we're going to have to sort of edit that out. There we go, we're back to normal. All right, so I'm going to restart. And if you have to edit that out, you can do so. So let's just mention what I've alluded to, which is the three different types of trauma. This is all relatively common sense, okay, but I just want to put some definition on it. There's what we referred to earlier as a one-time massive terrible incident. That's called acute trauma. Then there's what we call chronic trauma, working for a terribly, terribly awful boss, for example, or an awful company that put you through, unholy hell. That could occur, that kind of trauma could occur across someone's childhood or in periods of their childhood, or it could occur across a period or the span of a job. And as you can see, it's not a one-time incident, it's not just PTSD in any sense, it's just a bit more complicated. And then there's what we call complex trauma, which is exposure to multiple and varied types of traumatic event of an invasive or interpersonal nature. And that's obviously much more complicated. So this inevitably leads to one of the big subjects we want to explore here today, which is simply where does some of this stuff come from? Well, you can guess, can't you? It's going to potentially come from childhood. And as you know, in the workplace, we don't tend to talk about childhood. How was your childhood? Well, let me tell you. How long have you got and how terrible a story can you hear? Early childhood, sometimes defined as the years 0 to 6, but potentially later too, can lead to what we call developmental trauma, which can actually have an impact on our brain and our brain's development path, and can literally cause brain issues that are obviously way beneath the surface that are leading to these problems in adult life. And so forth. So I'm going to ask you an age, okay? You don't need to answer this, okay? Because this is pretty potentially personal. First of all, just rhetorical questions here. How old are you? Okay, fine. How old are you emotionally? Now there's a good question. Okay, now can you think of somebody else, either of you, who their emotional age would be different if they're really honest? Not totally, but to some degree. Their emotional age is different from their physical age. Anyone you can think of?
I can, but obviously I don't want to name the person. Is this what?
No, that's not a good idea.
Definitely not a good idea. But how old are they emotionally?
I would say a good, probably a dozen years younger than they are.
Okay, so a dozen years younger. So another example I would give you is a person who was talking to me this week who said, you know, this friend of theirs is really emotionally a teenager, even though they're about 52 years old. That doesn't mean they walk around being a teenager all day. No. What it means is that when there are jugular issues coming up in life, they revert back into a sort of teenage way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And that is severely limiting their life in certain senses. So that's what we sometimes call developmental trauma, where there's something happened and they're almost frozen in time, either overall or potentially in some really significant respects. It's a big subject, but you get the idea. So what I'm going to talk you through is something I wasn't expecting to talk you through. There's a thing which I only discovered when I moved to America. So it's one of the advantages of having moved to America. We in the UK, I find, don't know about this, haven't heard about it in this clear a sense, okay? So there was a thing they uncovered many years ago now in America called adverse childhood experiences, okay? Now you and I can guess, you know, oh yes, difficult childhood, okay, problems, okay. This is a much more systematic analysis and presentation, okay? What are potential sources of trauma? Well, if traumas potentially occur in childhood, okay, and we carry some of the effects of that with us, this refers, it says here, to some of the most intensive and frequently occurring sources of stress that children may suffer in the earliest stages of life. So, come with me, will you, to the bottom of this pyramid here, okay? What they found was in the research, I'm going to go through this in a second, adverse childhood experiences, depending on what they were and how bad they were and how many they were, okay, as you might potentially guess, can lead to the second step here, which is social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. Okay, it's a big subject. We're not going to get too much into that. This can in turn lead to them adopting health risk-related behavior, and even just behavior that is just very damaging. You know, can't sustain social relationships, can't sustain romantic relationships. They just sort of destroy them without even realizing they're doing it. They adopt risky behavior in general. They hang out with the wrong people that are going to lead them down paths that are not helpful, etc. And believe it or not, this can actually foster disease, disability, and other kinds of social problems, which ultimately can literally lead to early death and disease. So from birth through to death, can you see that life outcomes for folks who've gone through somewhat traumatic experiences of varying degrees can lead to these problems? So let's put this in context here. What kinds of adverse childhood experiences are we referring to? Well, you can probably guess, can't you? Physical abuse in the home, being physically bashed and beaten by a parent, okay, could lead to trouble ahead. Emotional abuse, of various kinds, you know, you're no good, you'll never amount to anything. All these kinds of messages can lead to deep programming that leads to unhealthy outcomes longer term and damage. Obviously, sexual abuse is a given, you know, that would be a very damaging thing to a child to have to deal with. But also physical neglect, you know, not having enough food, not feeling, you know, confident that there's any just food and basics and shelter and stuff. Emotional neglect, parents that really don't bother with their kids, you know, give them an iPad. Believe it or not, I hear about that even in affluent areas today, where youngsters are basically just given a TV and an iPad and told to amuse themselves because the parents can't be bothered. So that's emotional neglect. Households with mental illness, where there's somebody in prison, where there's substance abuse, or mental health problems, I think I mentioned that earlier, where someone was treated violently in the house. That can actually occur both ways today. There are plenty of men getting battered, believe it or not. Or divorce. You know, those are sort of examples of these adverse childhood experiences. Now, believe it or not, they actually expanded on this list later on, and witnessing violence or death from toxic causes in your community. So if you live in an area where there are people dying of drugs, you know, roundabouts, and you see such things that could affect you, feeling or being permanently unsafe in your neighborhood, you know, certainly see and hear about that sort of thing. Experiencing racism can be another example of a traumatizing, you know, journey through life, and living in the foster care system or experiencing bullying. Now, some lists have as many as 20 different sources of adverse childhood or traumatic or potentially traumatic experiences. And of course, you know, let's not forget some of these things on the right-hand side here can even occur still in adulthood. Absolutely. And cause some damage along the way. So forgive me bouncing through here, but I want to get to the really significant bits, okay? So first of all, just give you a few numbers here. You know, how many of those 10, it's the main 10 anyway, the bigger the list gets, the more complex it gets, but just of those 10, how many folks did they find when they looked at the data? And this was health insurance, you know, reliable data and polling and things over huge numbers of participants when they did these various studies. The answer was, you know, only about 36 of people had not experienced any of those 10 things. Lucky old them. Okay, 26 people had experienced one of those things. Okay, well, that's, you know, it's unfortunate, but, you know, it's not the end of the world necessarily, or major consequences. 16% had experienced 2 of those things out of the 10. 3 of those things have been experienced by about 10% of people, 9.5, and then 4 or more of those things have been experienced by people at a rate of about 12.5%. Okay, now what's the significance of that? So notice here it says here, 1 or more ACEs were experienced by 64% of the population. Yeah. That's 2/3 of us.
It's a cumulative effect, isn't it?
An ACE or more, okay? Now what's the significance of this? Okay, well, let's just look for a second at the prevalence. I'm not gonna go through all these numbers with you. You know, we'll be here all day if I go through them all, but, you know, different types of abuse in the home towards the children, okay, occurs at varying rates here. Neglect occurs at a slightly lower rate, but still pretty serious for those that it affects. Substance abuse in the home, 1 in 4. Parental divorce, of course, that's at least 1 in 4, probably more like 50% these days, I guess, who knows. Mental illness in the home, 1 in 5. Mother or somebody treated violently, an incarcerated household member and so forth. So that's the prevalence, but this is cut to the chase here, okay? What impact do these ACEs have? Basically, once you get to especially 3 or more, but especially 4 or more of these ACEs out of just the 10, let alone the rest of them, okay? The risk for negative health and life consequences goes up and up and up, especially with 4 or more, okay, of suffering the adverse effects, okay? Just take a simple example here. This is just one I pulled off the web. Childhood experiences versus suffering alcoholism in adulthood, okay? As you can see, any ACEs produces some risk and prevalence. 3, but especially 4 or more, and you're at high risk of having alcohol problems. Why? Because you've gone through things that have affected you so deeply that you're looking for ways, and alcohol is one of them, to self-soothe, to self-medicate, and to just cope with being alive. It's a very, very serious example. So let's go further then. What sorts of things to soothe the pain and various other things are potentially going on with folks who have gone through trauma of any kind, either in childhood or in adulthood? These are the things that they identified. This is one of the most landmark history impacting studies that they've ever done over here, okay? And I think sometimes in the UK, if you haven't come across this, because I hadn't come across it despite living here for 2 or 3 years, and then I was like, oh wow, suddenly they've got some names and some badges and some consequences mapped out in crystal clear, unequivocal detail from the data information. Basically, certain behaviours may occur if you've been a victim of trauma in childhood to some degree or another, however many on that list, etc. So for example, lack of physical activity could be just one consequence, not conscious, but that you just end up having, because of course you're looking for positives, pleasures, and physical activities not necessarily found to be an easy one. Smoking, alcoholism, drug use, and of course, possible consequence there would be just missing work. You know, getting too drunk here, there, and everywhere, and just basically struggling to sort of cope with the day-to-day demands of a working job, and that can lead to losing jobs, not progressing in jobs, etc. And then there's physical and mental health, you know, severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, I think that's a lung-related thing, and even bone, you know, health and stuff are all affected by these difficult forms of history in a person. So, what are we saying overall then? Okay, experience of these adverse childhood experiences, which are potentially traumatic experiences to some degree or another, the higher the rate, the higher the impact on life and work outcomes. Now, I'm not going to read all this out to you, but health impact, behavioural impact, and life potential. So, even things like, graduating through school and colleges, academic achievements, and lost time at work and lost progression at work are all impacted the more these life traumas that you've gone through. Now, most people who are affected in this way have no real concrete, clear sense of, aha, I've got an ACE score of 5. Maybe that's why I'm having some trouble in life on many levels. Okay, I introduced somebody recently to this, and their ACE score was 5 out of 10. And you know what they said? They said, wow, that's a bit alarming for me, but I'm going to follow the things you've told me about to make sure that A, my child doesn't have to go through this, and B, that I'm doing what I need to do to make sure I'm overcoming these things and addressing these things. So that's the good news. All right, let's pause. I'm throwing a whole lot at you, I know that, but we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, good, really good stuff. The first thing that struck me was on one of the very first slides where it talked about never again.
Yes.
And Carol and I have recently had a conversation. We've been recording our journeys and our career history in a video, and I've recently done mine, and we've looked at pivotal moments within our lives and the significance of those moments. And that very phrase was one of the phrases that I talked about and I used describing an incident that happened to me as a child and the impact that it had on me. And I think I said I was about 13 or so doing a presentation and being really anxious and nervous doing this presentation, having to read something out in assembly and being really anxious. But as I came off stage, there wasn't a stage, but as I came off doing it, I can remember going through the double doors and saying, that will never happen to me again. I will never stand in front of a group and be that nervous and anxious ridden again. And that has been one of the things that I've worked on throughout my life, really, in my professional life, being able to stand up and deliver presentations. And I do that, and I don't have a problem with it. I get nervous, but I don't have a problem with it. I've used that as a motivator to push me along, to say, actually, that's never gonna happen to me again, because it was mortifying, being there and being so young. So that sentence there, in terms of my own experience, I get that. Never again am I going to stand up in front of a group and feel that that anxiety again. So really good stuff, and it is about the influence and control.
It really is.
Feeling.
But you would never think that of you now in your life, and I was quite surprised during the conversation when you said that. But it's obviously taught you such a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as a child, I didn't know how to channel that anxiety, and so it was a bit like being on a roller coaster, and you're on it and you can't get off till you get to the end. So I stood up there, looked at everybody, and thought, oh dear.
Definitely. So these are sometimes called key decisions, and you can have a key, negative decision that you may or may not consciously register, which is presentations can kill you or almost kill you. Don't be doing that again. Sometimes people have a different reaction, which is, I'm never going to let somebody treat me this way again.
Yeah.
Okay, now that may or may not be empowering, because of course some people, what they do is, if they've been mistreated, they go too far and they become fiercely self-protective, and that in itself becomes another destructive reaction to a negative experience. So this is the difficulty, is we're all trying to cope with life, respond resourcefully with life, and the difficulty is when we have usually an overreaction or a non-constructive reaction then but that's life. You know, we don't quite know it's happening at the time.
Yeah.
And
I don't think I would have labelled it until now that was trauma.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
that's really
Quite a
significant
few
for me.
things I wouldn't have labelled as trauma that now are trauma. I
Yes.
recognise as it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's deeper than the wound and the wounding, isn't it? It's it's much more significant than that. So yeah, thank you for that. There was another bit
yes,
about when you talked about survival skills, and I was wondering about the link between the survival skills and what we know in terms of coaching and safety behaviours. You know, and the link between those two. Because I think that often people, their patterns of behaviour and their routines can be helpful to a point, and then they can become disenabling.
Well, definitely. So, you know, in the world of understanding people would typically say, you know, anything in extreme becomes a problem. Yeah. Because, you know, like I do certain things and they're my strengths. Okay, if I do them too much in the wrong circumstance, they actually they backfire.
Yeah.
So absolutely. So this is the trouble with especially trauma survivors, is that they tend to adopt certain things which genuinely may have helped them survive back when the trauma stuff was occurring and after. But the trouble is they overgeneralize and they just think, you know, it's like that phrase, you know, he who has a hammer thinks everything is a nail. Okay, just because you once bashed a nail
go whack it,
survive, doesn't mean everybody is a nail to be bashed.
Yeah, heavy-handed with everything. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, if you study some of the great therapists, they'll usually say, you know, there's a time and a place to engage in what right now is a negative behavior. Yeah. But now's not the time. Yeah. You know, being able to tell somebody to go away because they're a horrible person might be okay in some circumstances, but if you do that with your boss, it may not go well because it's not an adaptive, it's actually a overused behavior.
Yeah.
And you get the idea. So big subject, lots of millions of different examples, you know, workplace, private life.
Before you move on, you know, you talked about the pandemic.
Oh, yes.
And the trauma that might well be there for some people coming out of lockdown. Yep. The other thing that sprung to my mind is the protests around Black Lives Matter. Definitely. And the trauma that will be there and evident after we work through some of the things that we need to work through with that agenda. So that's that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
It really is. I mean, you know, so let's talk about both those things for a moment. You know, I remember you and I had a conversation, didn't we, about just the fact that, you know, lots of people's experience of traumatic treatment and grotesque or inappropriate or unprofessional or whatever it was treatment, racially speaking, will have been triggered by the mere massive conversation and protests around this subject. So lots of people have old wounds from over many, many years. Some people, especially the wounds, are probably worse, you know, the further back you go, because racism, unfortunately, was worse in decades gone by. But they will have been reactivated and almost refreshed and potentially somewhat re-traumatized to relive some of those things. But the thing with trauma is it ultimately needs to be processed, and it needs to be, you know, dealt with as constructively as we can. You know, we can't be carrying the thing that happened 40 years ago in a way, we can remember it, but we can't be carrying it in a way that holds us back or hurts us still. Because there has to be some kind of, you know, working through and healing from bad or terrible events. Otherwise we just end up being a victim of them, you know, forever.
But it's the lack, isn't it? The lack of working through that's happened in the past that has led to a lot of the stuff that's the stuff that's going on today. And some people, you know, that's sweeping it under the carpet, that it's, you know, it's not an issue now, it happened. This is the lack of understanding around trauma. You know.
Because, I mean, I remember mentioning to you a book I'd come across that talked about intergenerational racial trauma. And you're absolutely right what you just said, the fact that plenty of folks just don't get it, didn't experience it, so they don't get it and they don't realize the significance and the depths of those wounds and that mistreatment. So then let's flip to the COVID situation, okay? Lots of those things on those ACEs, okay, that may or may not have occurred in some homes have potentially, the fear is that they've been occurring at higher rates because of the pressures of lost jobs, lost income, being stuck in the house all week long. You know, kids that maybe had some behavioural challenges before are probably more aggravated than ever, harder to manage than ever. Who knows? But the difficulty is in this period of trying to cope with all these new pressures and weird circumstances is there more trauma going on to varying degrees behind the scenes in people's lives, you know? And that's very concerning.
But there's been a lot of wall building as well. There's been, I just feel in this time of COVID-19, people have, yes, okay, everybody wants to be helpful and supportive of each other, but there's been an awful lot of wall building as well. So you go out to the shops and people are openly saying, walking around, you know, on the phone, which I think I've said before, I can't stand listening to all of that, but you know, openly saying and criticizing what people are doing in the store. You know, they're too near, they're not considerate, they're not, and these people are not themselves considerate because they're not wearing the mask, they're not bothered about really being that near.
Yep.
And it's that wall, isn't it? Because you've all of a sudden, you've created this screen, you're not engaging in people and showing support. And that's what I found deeply disturbing during this time since March.
That's right. It's the good and bad sides of people, isn't it? And various circumstances.
Always. Yeah. And I've had a reason, which I won't go into in depth, but to go to a hospital for a scan, and found out all very mixed. With, you know, and they didn't. This particular medical centre didn't actually come together about what you should and should not be doing, and that alarmed me. But I thought, right, okay, let's get on with it, you know. Yeah, all different degrees of what is right and what is wrong, and never the twain shall meet, which is what you're talking about, you know. Not recognising.
That's right. So let's just ground a little bit of what we just said, okay? And this all, you can go deeper and deeper into this stuff, okay? But basically when it comes to our mental good health, okay, a healthy nervous system, okay, when you experience what we call arousal or activation by some event that's maybe not entirely welcome, or even a bad event or a negative event of some kind, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems get triggered and activated at various stages. And this sort of up and down of, you know, emotion and physical, you know, changes in the body and things. If those things are occurring, the up and down, okay, of these kinds of challenging events and things, they occur within the normal range, which is a good and healthy, expansive enough range, okay, of emotional, you know, range. You're okay, and you'll get through stuff, and you'll, you know, you'll cope in a reasonably okay manner, the same as your average person might reasonably do. Okay, what happens is, there's a slightly more sophisticated diagram here. What happens is undischarged traumatic stress, okay, especially in response to the traumatic event, leads to what they would broadly call emotional dysregulation. What that means is this, what's called the window of tolerance, okay, of dealing with the ups and downs of life and work and relationships and what have you, becomes, it gets messed up basically. And that could occur at a relatively early stage of life, and people get either stuck in the on position, okay, their default is to be highly strung, or they get stuck in the off mode, which is to be on default very lowly strung. So let's just look at that for a second, okay? They're basically operating within a narrower window, okay, a smaller window of tolerance, and they either live fundamentally up here or fundamentally down here. And that's why they're unusual, and their behavior and their attitudes are unusual, and they may not even begin to understand why, because trauma has affected them deeply, and we need to understand that. So if they're stuck in the on position, that means they're too hyper aroused, okay, and in response to often things in life. They may suffer greater levels of anxiety, panic, hyperactivity, exaggerated startle response. Oh my goodness, what was that? It's the kind of intense reaction that you get from people that are affected by these things. Inability to really relax, you know, they're constantly restless, they're constantly, you know, the radar's on all the time. The detection system's on all the time. Hypervigilance, digestive problems, emotional flooding, chronic pain, sleeplessness, and potential hostility and rage. These the folks who've said, once I got burned in life by somebody or something, it will never happen again, because if it does, I'll be ready this time. It will never happen again. Do you see? It's too highly strung, too fiercely self-protective, and it only really makes their lives harder. At the other end, you've got the opposite. okay, which is stuck, as it says here, in a sort of depression, and that's very, very, what we call flat affect, lethargy, deadness, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, and broad disorientation. They're disconnected or even dissociated from life, which means they sort of live life fundamentally in a bit of a haze. I don't know where the last week has gone. I don't know where the day has gone.
Yeah.
You know, not really fully present, because what they've done is they've gone back here, they've taken a step back and said, I'm going to live my life rather detached from it, because that's just safer. Then you don't get hurt, or the risk is lower. Disconnection, dissociation, complex syndromes, pain, lower blood pressure, poor digestion. These are possible physical manifestations of the kind of stuckness that someone's in. By the way, you can't often tell people, I think this is you, because it's a very awkward subject, and it's just, it's complicated and what have you. You get the idea. So, and that's called the window of tolerance. Okay, it's a huge advancement for us to understand what broadly healthy range of emotional function is and what it means to have a narrower. So what happens is people with a narrow window of tolerance are far too easily triggered than is helpful, than is normal and empowering, or far too not triggered. You know, even abusive situations don't really trigger them to say, I need to protect myself, or whatever it is, at work or at home. So let's just mention where we can go with this, okay, in the workplace, because some of the different programs that you guys are involved in, and even just, you know, in the workplace in general, just being aware of this type of thing is frankly, you know, doing better. So I'm going to talk here for a moment about traditional care of especially troubled folks, but also people in the workplace, versus what we call these days trauma-informed care of our staff or our folks. So in the old view, as it says here, you know, here's what's wrong with you. Okay, that's the sort of classic approach. So this would see clients or staff as broken, vulnerable, damaged, and needing protection from themselves. Agencies and providers are responsible for fixing the problem, which is, of course, the person. Okay, the more trauma-informed approach says that we understand understands that providing clients or staff with the maximum level of choices, autonomy, self-determination, dignity, and respect is central to healing. So they're more interested in providing a safe working environment where we can expect, especially certain people who may have a trauma history, to have stronger reactions, more pushback, more this, more that, and try to make it as safe as possible. So you mentioned earlier coaching, for example. You know, a really good coach will generally make it safe to talk about stuff. They will foster safety up front. And all I'm saying in this presentation here is that's really sound practice for all humans, but especially with a remembrance that some people do have issues that cause them to have particularly strong reactions. So that would be a good practice, making it truly safe and waiting and finding out what it takes to make them feel safe and create safety for them. That's one way of doing that. You know, self-determination. So for example, in some of our social service programs of the organization I'm involved in over here, they have created environments where people can have a voice, you know, and the food, a voice in how we deal with this problem, a voice in how we deal with that one. You know, democratic principles have shown, and we show people, you know, you can have some power. You can have some voice to some reasonable degree, and help them to make their own choices and decisions. I mean, that's what we do in good coaching, isn't it? We say, you know, so what choice are you going to make on this issue? Because in the past, your issue was to stay home and avoid work. What choices are you going to make now? And help people realize you get to make the choices. Don't let them happen on autopilot or out of fear, for example. Little quote for you here, what we can do at work. Trauma-informed services or care of people assumes that people are doing the best they can at any given time to cope with the life-altering and frequently catastrophic effects of trauma. Because childhood and adult victimization can lead to disconnection with self and isolation from others, the challenge is to develop services and support or other systems that create authentic reconnection, reparation, and healing. Let's put this in plain common sense language, shall we? If we care, what I'm suggesting for folks like you, me, and the people watching this, is that if we care, we must succeed in conveying to folks that we work with or that we're, you know, working with and help supporting, you know, a sense that, you know, I get you, enough to make it possible for you to be more likely than elsewhere to feel safe here. Now, let's take an example, right? You know, we three, okay, if we have a chit chat and a dialogue, okay, we know on autopilot how to create safety, how to, you know, talk about difficult things, negative feedback, concerns, etc., and it will be safe. And even if it gets a little bit on the edge, okay, we'll be okay because we can talk about it. Okay, some people it's not that straightforward at all. You know, you've had conversations with negative feedback with some people, and you can see them almost like that on the defensive. Yeah. Oh, I'm not dealing with this. I don't care what people think. I don't agree. Okay, well, it's not about whether you agree. It's about what is your whole team saying, that is gonna be your downfall and the downfall of this team. Doing that's a strong reaction, maybe because they got burned at some point in the past. And I will serve you as best I can, because change, good relationships, and progress is possible. So I must say, Marcia, a conversation we had about some of the folks that you serve in your work, I was reminded of some of this material and what you described with some of those folks. You know, people that have stronger reactions, more difficult reactions, more truculent reactions, and you kind of want to say, what's wrong with you? But you don't want to say that because you know things have happened that have made them this way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And to make it safe, especially around each other, not just you, but around each other, is not easy, but we can do it. And we can help them understand how to create safety for themselves and in the environments that they're in. So you get the idea. So just a bit of a sense of where that goes. So earlier I mentioned to you, the 4 ways in which you may see this sort of stuff manifest. Words like trauma and abuse are highly charged for many people and are frequently misunderstood. Keep away from them and don't get into exploring people's traumas day to day, okay? And even in the workplace or with your clients, focus instead on the results of exposure to trauma, which are experiences that everyone can relate to, whether they have been traumatized or abused in the past or not. This comes from the work of the lady mentioned there. They use in their places, and I've seen this occurring in social service units, they talk about, supporting people's sense of self, and they talk about this first bit here, which is the loss of the sense of safety, which is very easily triggered unless we make it safe. So I mentioned to you earlier, folks with trauma history usually don't feel safe anywhere, period. And they're not always consciously aware that they don't feel safe. They're always on alert. How is Carol Cooper going to hurt me? How is Marcia going to hurt me? Even though they seem like they care. That may seem irrational to some of us, but it is irrational. That's the point. Yeah. And you can't work with it unless you can anticipate. Some people have deep emotional reactions they can't even consciously articulate because they're buried. Yeah. So that's one way. Another one to add to the list here is, their inability sometimes to manage their emotions, having intense reactions and things. So I know some of the stuff I think you do, Marcia. Forgive me, Carol, I don't always know what you're doing with the different client groups, but, helping folks to learn the skills of emotional regulation. Someone walks down the street and they say, oh, you're an idiot. What are you looking at? Okay. Some people will have a far stronger, almost punch your lights out reaction to some of us. If I'm walking down, New York City, wherever it is, and somebody says, what are you looking at, you idiot? I'll go, okay, what's your issue? And just keep walking. Okay, but that is learning that you have a choice and that a lot of these things are about other people, etc., etc. Now, some people need to learn that skill. Not everything is a source of danger. Etc. Coping skills, just learning how to manage their emotions. I mean, that's all, isn't it? Emotional intelligence, emotion management, all those kinds of things, big subjects, but we can help folks to learn and have options with that stuff. Coping with loss, you didn't get that job, sorry to have to tell you this. Okay, some people will go, oh, that's very sad. Okay, well, never mind. Other people, it's the end of the world. Yeah. And remember in one of our sessions, I said, have you mapped your team? What's unique about Jane? What's unique about Jim? Okay, if you can predict, I don't know what the story is with Jane or Jim, but they're not going to handle this well. Okay, well, that tells me I'm going to have to help them cope with the loss more than my other team member.
Yeah.
And I can do that, but I need to be aware that something seems to be off kilter here.
Yeah.
And then, not even beginning to think about the future. So people that can't get things done, that's a sign usually that they're affected up here by the ability or the inability to plan sufficiently and follow through on their plans. That's called executive function. That's about having difficulty getting stuff done because they don't even remember to get it done, much less have the skills to push on and stay focused until they get it done. Or to even have a sense of the future. What are you looking for in your career? What are you looking for in your career? I don't know. Sometimes people that are that flat are actually affected by this thing, and just gently encouraging them to have a bit of a vision could be a bit of progress. So what does it mean? Trauma-informed care or programs, actively teaching and fostering the skills to help improve well-being, regulation, and create a sense of safety and the skills needed to gradually improve their quality of life. Just so you know, this goes bigger and deeper. If you look into some of the models I'm sharing with you here, one of the models there has these various areas, but it's things I've already mentioned, creating a bit more of a sense of democracy. We can make decisions as a group together. I don't have to just submit to the authority. Learning that we can grow and learn new things and change can happen, and that's not something to necessarily be afraid of. Learning what it means to be emotionally intelligent. Open communication, social responsibility. How about we recycle stuff? Instead of just chucking it all in the bin and not caring about our impact on the environment, awareness of others, All these different things can help. This involves in some of our centres, social service centres, community meetings, team decision making, red flag reviews, helping people understand, you can't go around screaming and yelling and calling people all the names under the sun, at least not here at work, because that's just not going to fly. Safety plans. What are you going to do if you feel upset and unsafe and this and the other? Okay, what can you do? And there's an example here of a safety plan that somebody came up with. You can imagine us doing a bit of this, can't you, in coaching, potentially. The world is a dangerous and unsafe place. To me, I know, Marcia, we had this conversation, didn't we, about, talking about, I've had a pretty nice life, pretty nice journey, lucky old me, okay. Some people, the world, as it says here, is a dangerous and unsafe place on a level I can barely understand. Okay, so a little quote for you here. Stimuli present during the trauma becomes associated with the perception of threat, and thus it activates the fear structure within a person, which in turn leads to escape or avoidance behaviours. I'm in danger, I must escape. They leave the building. I'm in danger, I must escape. I'm going to avoid the boss for the next 6 months. All sorts of non-verbal stuff coming through. And the two beliefs under that sort of traumatized reaction is the world is entirely dangerous and I am completely incompetent. Now, some people will never say, I feel incompetent. They're going to say, no, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm okay, and they're not. And if you can get a sense that this person needs some tangible, concrete reassurance about their strengths and what they bring to the table and stuff, you can sort of help to sort of calm them down and gently help them move in at least a better direction. Also want to mention there's something not just called post-traumatic stress disorder, there's something called post-traumatic growth. Okay, I was very glad to hear about this. I was like, wow, people can grow. And I think, Marcia, you gave us a lovely example through these experiences, in spite and also even because of these experiences. And not only heal, which is the fundamental thing that needs to happen, but actually potentially grow through them. So it says here, the pain individuals experience from trauma should not be minimized, yet it does not have to be the centerpiece of their identity. Most survivors display a stunning capacity for survival and perseverance. Growth and pain are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but instead are inextricably linked in recovery from trauma. So let me just mention to you very clearly, what does that mean, okay? It means, first of all, somebody has to not just accept they've got some issues and might want to go get some support and some help, but they need to ultimately be identified as someone who has experienced actual trauma in tangible, concrete terms. I've come across people who don't realize the way they were treated in childhood was actually abusive and bound to have caused them troubles and difficulties, okay? Then they need to get not just, psychotherapy. They need to get someone who is capable of guiding them through recovery from specifically trauma, okay? So there are things like EMDR and other forms of trauma-specific therapy that can actually concretely help the person to literally take the sting out of that trauma and learn how to unlock the parts of themselves that have been shut off. Like the ability to ask for things, the ability to want things, the ability to be present. Mindfulness meditation is another thing that can just bring, remember we said some people operate up here, other people down here, okay? Mindfulness meditation helps you come back into the positive zone and stay more often in the more healthy bandwidth of emotional regulation. So things like that can help. A friend of mine runs a program where he has people from a very, very difficult community, shootings, drug issues, gangs, and all sorts of stuff. When they start their day with 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation, the day is always better. And that alone is helping folks to just gently start to exert a bit more power and control. Okay, so just to mention resources, okay, it took me a long time before I finally watched this talk by, her name is Nadine Burke-Harris. She was one of the pioneers really in this area. I highly recommend her talk on YouTube. It's called How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across the Lifespan. Now bear in mind, she's a medical doctor. So she was very concerned about the long-term, health impact of, these traumatizing events potentially, but she certainly gets into the other stuff too. Just watching the TED Talk would be a great start, really and truly. She did write a book. I've read the book too. Fantastic book. It does cover the broader range, but, just see how you go with the TED Talk and take it from there. Another book I found helpful, a bit more of a technical book really, but still fairly accessible, is called Psychology of Trauma 101. And that's a bit more of a sort of academic and psychology related angle. So in closing then, the mark of fear is not easily removed. how desperately true that is. Now, some people, I mentioned this early on, will just flat out deny that they're ever afraid. I'm not afraid. What do you mean? Why are you afraid? What do you mean? I know what you're talking about, okay? But they're actually really afraid. And all their behavior shows you that they're literally living in fear and self-protection, all this kind of stuff. How can you help somebody who is going to deny they have any issues whatsoever? The answer is, frankly, sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
That's sad and tragic, but it may not be you to do it, and that's life. Tell you what I have found helpful is to give people the ACEs questionnaire. And I could send you a copy on a PDF.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Questions,
Thank
what
you.
is your score? And then help them to sort of self-diagnose. I've seen this, I'll just mention, there's so many things, this is such a big subject, but let me just mention to you, there's a video on YouTube, it's quite famous now. They basically get people in prison to answer the 10 questions, right? And what they do is every time, they get them in a massive circle, okay? And they're usually about something like, I don't know, so many steps away, maybe 20 steps away, okay? Every time the answer is yes. Did you experience this in childhood? Did you experience that in childhood? What happens is they get closer and closer.
Yeah,
and closer.
step in.
And what you realize is the variance in the group, but the fact that most people, sadly, in prison have probably more likely had significant number of ACEs.
Yeah.
And this has led to them, unfortunately, having a negative life trajectory as a result.
Yeah.
So practical suggestions then to finish up on. I would suggest to anyone who's enjoyed this session and who wants to explore this more, go watch that TED Talk. Really a fantastic, powerful thing. That will lead you on to other things. Consider reading the book, for example. If you want more recommendations, I can gladly give you those. Concentrate on how to foster safe and trauma-informed or more sensitive environments, okay, that are just very deliberately taking account of people's needs. And it's really those 4 areas. You know, emotional regulation, and the other things that were listed earlier. I would suggest doing the ACEs questionnaire. I was with somebody recently and they did it and their score was 5 out of 10 and they went, whoa. And they're a, you know, happy, functional person, their life is in a good place, but they want to get on it and make sure their child doesn't suffer from it, any of these things as much as possible, and that they themselves are doing the work necessary to address and push through any impact of trauma on their lives. Now, again, I want to come back to something you said, Marcia, that, you know, some people, and it's always quite remarkable, have managed to go through very little that would constitute trauma. So I'll give you an example. I could think of somebody who had some bullying in school, okay, and did not do well with that, and did not develop coping skills. For them, although it wasn't too terrible, it was fairly terrible, and for them, and this is a relativization too, it constituted trauma. Okay, now some people would look at that and go, for goodness sake, you know, that's a bit of a strong reaction. Okay, well, yes, it was. But for them, they decided, like you did, Marcia, in your situation, I'm no good. And the world is a dangerous place. Those 2 things we talked about earlier. And I tell you now, that person's life has been severely impacted by what for them was trauma. Even though they came from a loving, caring home, etc., etc. Now, they probably had some issues with the mother too, what have you, but their life has been deeply affected by that, because for them it became trauma, even if it wasn't technically necessarily measurably that much more traumatic.
See it, yeah, absolutely.
Just to finish that off then, so get support will help for you. And again, you need not just a therapist, frankly, you need a therapist who understands or specializes in the actual concrete treatment of trauma. Trauma is not a good thing for basic psychotherapy or general psychotherapy. Trauma these days is a specific discipline, and we need to be aware of that and help folks understand that. Find sources of support for those that you work with. You know, I mean, I do sessions here sometimes, you know, educating people on this stuff to help them understand and help themselves to go on their own journey. These would be the steps. Do the ACEs questionnaire. Find out if you've got some issues. Find out what your score is. Go and get trauma-specific therapy to concretely address this stuff. And help folks find their own path. You know, we have the organization I work for, you know, what is it called? Addiction centers. Okay, and using a tool like this can be very powerful to help folks diagnose their own challenges in a way that they find, you know, not shaming or embarrassing, because there is hope for better outcomes for people's lives. And if we're not blind to these issues and we begin to grasp, wow, this is actually really serious stuff, but there is hope and there is help. And
well, I'll tell you what, I hadn't recognised that quite a lot of this stuff was traumatic. I knew it was problematic.
Yep.
But to put it into this text now of trauma, I do recognise quite a lot of that. But I didn't. I just thought it was problematic more than traumatic, which is quite. So
And that's the thing. And I appreciate you saying that, Carol. That's the thing, right? We kind of always knew it was troublesome, okay? But when you literally go, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, oh boy, 6 out of 10.
Yeah.
Apparently, that is really serious. In every level, physical, emotional, mental health are all going to probably be affected.
Yeah.
By that. Okay, do I need to do anything, or am I actually doing pretty good in spite of everything? Because you know, some people, they've done well in life despite the terrible upbringings or the terrible traumas they went through. They really have. Somehow they've grown. Okay, lucky them. What about all the folks that need a helping hand?
Yeah. There's more that need help than you would ever know.
Very much, yeah.
Because we came up in that generation that you just didn't really discuss it. It was, again, problematic, but yeah, you got over it.
Yep.
And I've experienced that with lots of people that I've spoken to and mentored over the years.
Yep.
Of that. And it was always a problem. It was never any more. Now I understand that it obviously was more. And I will understand from now on a lot more about the trauma.
Yep.
So yeah, that was I've been a bit quite quiet, obviously, but just taking it all in and
contemplating what's been said and mulling it over. Absolutely, I totally get that, Cece.
Absolutely,
Totally get that.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say really, because I think recognition of so much has hit me today.
Yeah,
yes.
That's all I can. That's it in a nutshell. And
so let's notice then that reaction, which is, oh my gosh, this is actually a bigger subject than I ever thought it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I can still remember coming across that ACEs study and going, oh my gosh, over in England, we haven't heard of this. And of course, the same figures and statistics and probabilities all play out in our country as much as in America. But the point is, to me, it gives a crystal clear data, research-based, that's absolutely unequivocal, the impact of trauma in childhood, especially on life trajectories. And it's totally common sense, but when they got the data over literally thousands and thousands of people, and by the way, this may shock you, we could be careful, we're going to be here all day. That original data, and I can't speak to those exact figures I gave you and things, the original studies, believe it or not, were done on, I think it was a broadly sort of white middle class population. So can you imagine when they then eventually tracked different sectors of society?
So skewed, isn't it? So biased, absolutely.
So those figures are pretty horrifying on that basis. And when
on
they
that
did
basis alone, absolutely.
Now obviously you can get up-to-date figures and things, but you get the idea that, for different folks, those figures are going to be even higher.
This stuff fits into so many different agendas.
Yes.
But for me, there's a couple in particular that it sits in. And one of them is around the risk assessment agenda, organisational risk assessment. And there was something that we used to do many years ago in our day, CC, around psychological risk assessments, whether they're called wellbeing risk assessments now, because there was an onus on employers to ensure that there were systems and processes in place to ensure that the psychological well-being of their people was being supported within the organisation. It'd be interesting to know how this has fitted in and seeped into those risk assessments, in maybe not using the word necessarily trauma, but clearly identifying some of the stuff that's happening, particularly in terms of abuse.
Yeah.
And how that spills into the workplace. I mean, Carol and I have had many conversations about how in the good old days, if you like, they used to talk about leaving your personal stuff at the door before you came into work. So you could divide yourself up into
leave my suitcase outside again.
And just go into work and do your job. It was, ludicrous then, and it's equally as ludicrous now. But organisations are still trying to advocate for that you leave your stuff at home. So that fits in very, clearly into that risk assessment agenda. The other thing is around the equalities agenda, and whether we call it equalities now, because that doesn't quite seem to fit anymore. The diversity, inclusivity, equalities agenda, that just doesn't seem the right headings for the work that needs to be done. But it is around, when you gave that quote around victimization and stereotyping and things like that. That is some of the stuff that fits into that inclusivity part of the agenda, about recognizing people's skills, strengths, abilities, and the potential that they have to do not just the job that they on their job description, but that can grow into new roles.
That's right.
That's about the opportunity stuff, isn't it?
Very much.
The equalities agenda. So, you know, my head is firing off around how we can use some of this stuff equally in-house, as in with some of the people that we are working with. Again, can't thank you enough, really, Nigel. I'd like to ask if you're ever thinking of doing a course. Then, you know, 2 seats. Straight away, 2 seats required on that programme, because I think we need to go together, CC, rather than, you know, one at a time, and then we can compare. Compare. I know it's not that you're doing a course, but if you ever did one, please let us. Please
sign us up.
That'll be money well spent.
Well, just so you know, that what you just said there, Marcy, is I couldn't really major too much on it when we in our stuff here, but buried within that material, there is an element within that sort of, you know, safe and supportive and you know, contributing environments to keep folks, you know, feeling safe and able to operate effectively as possible, as often as possible. It's very much identifying, even within your own team members, you know, what are their strengths? How can we support continued growth? How can we help them in some of those key areas? But people that basically, as you can see, fundamentally may well ultimately think or feel, because they may not think that they're no good, but they may feel like they're no good. Do you see? It's not just thinking, and it's not just thinking, it's feeling. No. Sometimes the cognitive is out of whack with the emotional. So when you help folks to concretely not just think, oh, apparently I'm good at this, but feel it. Feel the applause. Feel how good that feels, to know you can do it. That's the emotional building of folks up, so that they realize, you know, maybe I don't have to think I'm a worthless piece of nothing. When I start to feel good, what you can start to do, as we know, is slowly start reprogramming and regrounding the human soul, so that it's sort of, you know, a bit freer.
And that's the stuff that we talk about in terms of coaching. You know, when you talk about the, you know, feeling the emotion, it's the anchoring an emotion, isn't it? That's, you know, that we try and help people to do, because it's, like you say, it's not just about the cognitive approach. It's how they feel that drives what they do, and the behaviour. So yeah, good reminder there. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the bit about my experience with staff of being around jealousy in the workplace and how debilitating that is, especially when a person in your team knows that somebody's envious of where they are, and they can drag them back or become the one that comes along to, say, me, for example, or the manager or whatever, to sort of twist the story or make it, trying to cast a black shadow over the person. So that's always, you know, it's not always believing what you hear. Just it is about sitting back and observing and you know, recognizing. But I've been, you know, involved in that in the workplace, and I found that for people very debilitating in large teams of people.
That's right. So huge subject, but I think we managed to get through that in a useful way.
Well, I've certainly learned a lot today. Massive, even.
Yeah, it's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure that people like the last one. We've got some lovely comments come through on the last one, and I know people have contacted you directly as well, Nigel, which has been fantastic. And I'm hoping that the same will happen again when we put this out, that people will be interested in what, you know, what you've got to say, the content. Go and look up some of the references that you've given us today, and again, approach you if they've got any questions that they want answering really around it, which will be fantastic. Can't thank you enough.
I'll send you the questionnaire, you can have a go.
Yes, please do send that, and we will have a go definitely at that. Thank you so much, Nigel. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, so much.
Thank you, bye.